in economics, and her research has focused on drivers of female labor participation, financial inclusion and development, and immigration. Following the summary of the book, Dr. Peter John Gordon, lecturer in the Department of Economics, will serve as discussant. Peter John has a PhD in economics and brings a wealth of both theoretical and applied economic knowledge to this discussion, having served here as a lecturer for more years than he would like me to mention this morning, as well as having worked with the PIOJ for 10 years, where he was Director of Economic Planning and Research. After Peter John's brief comments, we'll invite the panelists on stage and open up the session for a question and answer engagement. The panel will be chaired by Dr. Christine Clark, lecturer in the Department of Economics with a PhD in Economics and Public Finance. Christine has extensive experience in tax policy, fiscal management, public sector management, as well as economic analysis. She has worked at the Planning Institute of Jamaica as the Director of Economic Planning and Research, and she currently serves on the board of the Bank of Jamaica. The panel will be comprised of Krishna and Joyce, who we introduced earlier, as well as Inchi and Trevor. Dr. Inchi Octa is the IMF's Mission Chief for St. Kitts and Nevis and Division Chief of the Caribbean 3 Division of the Western Hemisphere Department. She holds a PhD in economics and previously worked at the World Bank. Her research covers financial stability, systemically important financial institutions, capital controls, exchange rate regimes, inflation targeting, financial crises, and global risks. And finally, Dr. Trevor Lane is an Assistant Director Division Chief of the Caribbean 1 Division at the IMF Western Hemisphere Department. He was previously Division Chief of the Caribbean 2 Division and also served as Mission Chief for Jamaica, Barbados, Bahamas, and Suriname. Very important to us here is the fact that Dr. Lane received a part of his education right here at UWI, having completed his BSc degree here. Now we're asking you to please prepare yourselves to ask very short and highly pertinent questions to the panelists, as our time is quite limited. After the panel discussion, we're going to show a very brief film, during which we will rearrange the stage in preparation for the arrival of Madame Lagarde at 11:35 a.m. We're asking everyone to remain seated throughout the entire event. So I'm now going to invite Dr. Krishna Srivasan to the stage and ask that all subsequent presenters proceed directly to the stage without further introductions. Let us please welcome Krishna.
Hello. Thank you, David, for that kind introduction, and thank you all for being here, and to the University of West Indies for allowing us to launch this book here. Seeing so many of you here makes me want to be back as a student. I hope sometime I'll be back as a faculty somewhere in the region. So let me just tell you very briefly about what we do at the IMF. At the IMF, we have three key functions. One, what we call as surveillance. As you know, we have 189 countries which are members of the IMF. And when we talk about surveillance, we go to every country once or twice a year to do a checkup of the economy. We do a checkup of the economy and then provide policy advice to the government as part of this effort. So in surveillance, we have two aspects, what we call as bilateral surveillance, where we go from country to country to all the 189 countries and talk to them about the condition of the economy and policy advice. We also have something called multilateral surveillance, where we produce what we call the World Economic Outlook, which brings together developments across the world. As part of our surveillance, we carry out research on various issues. And this book here represents research we have done over the last 2 years on issues facing the Caribbean economies, the challenges they face, and what could be the policies that would help overcome these challenges. So our policy advice is grounded in research and which is contained in this book. It covers a number of topics going from macroeconomics to structural factors such as crime, youth unemployment, and various other issues. The second thing which we do at the IMF is to provide financing to countries which have a balance of payments need. For instance, in the case of Jamaica, Jamaica has what we call a precautionary arrangement with the IMF, which is a credit line. So if Jamaica has any issues, has any problems with balance of payments, it can draw upon this line of credit. So that's the other thing we do. We provide financing, not to mistake us from the World Bank or the IFC. We provide lending only to central banks around the world when they face balance of payments problems. The last thing we do is capacity building. Capacity building, we provide technical assistance to countries to improve their central banking in terms of their fiscal, in terms of statistics, and we do this to all our members. In fact, you'll be surprised to know that 50% of the technical assistance we provide to all of Western Hemisphere, 50% of that is provided to Caribbean economies. So I'd like to, with that, let me just introduce today's speaker, Joyce Wong. She'll provide you a quick overview of the book, the key elements of the book, and then we'll be happy to answer questions after that. So Joyce, it's yours.
Good morning. I was wondering if my slides will be up on the screens. Let me just talk it through. There we go. Thank you so much. Given that I don't yet have a clicker, I will just say next. Good morning. My name is Joyce Wong. I'm an economist in the West. Independence right now is seeing kind of a structural break. Given all of these shocks, structural breaks, what does the Caribbean not have? The Caribbean also has very thin buffers. Many countries have very high debt. Jamaica, how many Jamaicans are in here? You know this, you hear this every day. Jamaica has very high debt. Many other Caribbean countries have very, very high debt. On top of it, We have things like a lot of non-performing loans. So bank lending is constrained because there's a lot of people who are not repaying. And then to add on top of that, you have issues with financial inclusion. Because if I'm not getting my loans back as a bank, I'm not going to lend. And I'm going to become more and more risk averse. And I'm going to try to avoid lending to people that I'm not absolutely sure about. So you get situations where large companies get a lot of credit and are doing very, very well. And the small entrepreneurs are not getting the funding that they badly, badly need. So let me just delve a little deeper into some of these issues, if you bear with me. Let me begin on the topic of natural disasters. And this is so recent and is so close to everybody's hearts right now. The Caribbean, although it's small, and I can say that, for example, China, US, of course they get hit with a lot more natural disasters in numbers, because they're much bigger countries, there's a lot more land to hit. But if you make it proportional to the land area of the Caribbean, so looking at how small the islands are and how often these disasters still hit, you can see from the chart on the left, those of you who have really good eyesight, the world average is the red line. And you can see that the vast majority of Caribbean countries is much, much higher. So you get hit much, much more often by natural disasters than other countries in the world, when you look at how small your country areas are. On top of it, when you get hit, because the countries are so small, these are also massive damages as a percent of GDP. So, for example, the recent case of Dominica, where the damages are over 200% of GDP. So it's 2 years of the country's income. So the shock is natural disasters. Now, this shock, that as I was saying, it's a shock that comes so often that might as well be structural. This shock hits very thin fiscal buffers. And we go back to the debt question. The debt in the Caribbean, as you can see from the left-hand chart, has been rising. And it's been rising to the levels that now it's the highest in the last half century. And it's 30% higher than the average in other emerging market and developing economies. So that's the middle chart. You can see that the vast majority of Caribbean countries, their little bars surpass the average, which is the dotted line. Once again, to those of you with really good eyesight. So what can Caribbean countries do to fix this? That's what we show in the last chart. This is what we call the adjustment. So how much do governments have to, in a sense, change their way of doing business, their primary surpluses? How much more do they have to save every year? And it's in the order of 5% of GDP, of 5 to 12% of GDP more, depending on the country. So governments would have to tighten their belts significantly if they wanted to bring their debt down naturally to about 60% of GDP, which by some metrics, we find that that is an adequate level for countries to not go into crises. Now, we've talked about shocks, we've talked about the buffers. Let me delve into the structural, and this is, I think, much more close to what all of you experience. Cost of doing business, buzzword, everybody's heard about this. The Caribbean ranks relatively not well in that ranking. Jamaica does extremely well, but as you can see, the vast majority of the red dots on that chart, it says that the Caribbean should be doing better than where they are. The costs of doing business are too high right now relative to the income level of these countries. And in the following slides, I'm going to show you a little bit of the areas where the Caribbean needs to improve. But the heat map, just let me delve a little bit into that. That is also to give a different view, which is what is constraining Caribbean countries. For the tourism countries, we see things like debt. We see things like non-performing loans, as I mentioned before. For all Caribbean countries, tourism or commodity, we see problems like skilled immigration. And I'm sure if I ask this room, how many of you are thinking about leaving the country or leaving the region, I would get a really good show of hands. I see some people smiling, so you guys know what I'm talking about. So brain drain, that's what we call. The brains here are draining out of the region, and this is one of the key issues. And then lastly, for commodity exporting economies, we also see the problem of diversification. These countries have been focused on one commodity for a very long time. There is a need to move them to other sectors. So, let me go even deeper now into cost of doing business. Energy costs. Caribbean is very dependent on oil to generate electricity, for transportation, etc. And the prices are very high. There's very little economies of scale in most of the electricity production. And as you can see, okay, the little tiny dots on the left side, that's US prices. And you can see that even for the lowest prices in the Caribbean, those are higher than the US prices. And then the scatter plot shows that a lot more countries in the Caribbean than in the emerging markets group feel constrained by electricity. So electricity costs. From my own experience, when oil prices dropped, in Jamaica specifically, I heard so much discussion that SMEs suddenly felt that they could invest because their electricity bill had been cut so much more. So it's real and it has been happening. Another big constraint is the access to finance. So just to give a little more meat into what I said before, this is from the World Bank Enterprise Survey, and a lot of small and medium enterprises say that they are constrained by lack of financing. That's the chart over there in blue bars. The black dotted line shows the average in the world, in Latin America, and we see that in the Caribbean there are more firms that feel constrained by lack of credit. Constrained in the sense of, if I could give you more credit, would you take it? Yes, I would, but I can't get it. Why is this? Spreads. Interest rate spreads are very high. So the bank receives deposits from you, from all of you, from your families, and then lends them out. The prices at which they pay, that difference, is very big in the Caribbean. Some of it is economies of scale, some of it is just market, others are regulation. Different reasons, but in general they're high. On the collateral requirements, they're also very high. What are collateral requirements? It means how much do you have to put up of your own assets in order to get a loan? So you can already see that if collateral requirements are very high, you have to have a good amount of wealth to borrow from a bank. Take the example of my own mother. My mom built her own restaurant. She had no collateral almost. She put up that restaurant as the collateral when she bought it. And that has financed me being here today. So access to finance can generate humongous gains, but it's got to be done so that everybody can enjoy it while balancing with the risks and stability of the financial system. Next, we have crime. And this, I'm sure, hits really close. You can see the scatter plot, and that scatter plot is really striking. Other than the countries in Central America like El Salvador and Honduras, the Caribbean is leading the pack on homicides. Just taking a second to breathe this in. St. Kitts, Jamaica, Trinidad, the Bahamas, they're all up there. And this entails cost. This entails cost to the government. This entails cost to the private sector, who have to hire their own security. And this entails social costs. Not just the costs of the criminals who are losing their lives participating in this, but also the victims themselves, who might have lower productivity after being a victim of a crime. So all of this has societal costs. Brain drain. We get to this topic in which all of you are going to leave this country. Look at those red dots. Those red dots says how much of skilled immigration happens in the region. Those red dots at the Caribbean, you are leading the pack. Everybody is going to the US, Canada, and the UK. This is why I know so many Jamaicans in DC, including one right here, Trevor. And all of this brain drain does not work for growth. Yes, some of these immigrants send remittances back, but those remittances are not enough to drive growth. The brain drain itself is too heavy. So you see that those red bars, the biggest one is the Caribbean. That's the most negative one. Central America does not have such a strong effect from this because they are losing less educated people. The Caribbean are losing the best and their brightest. One of the results of all this, and because tourism is so important for so many of these islands, we're highlighting this, is the loss of share in the tourism market. That declining line is how much the share in world tourism has come down. It's gone from about 2.6% to about 2% of the world tourism. It's still very big, yes, but the drop has been quite steep. And one of the things that we see that could be driving this is the prices, and that's the left chart. You see those red bars? Those are the prices of coming to the Caribbean for 7 days, hotel, taxi, meals. And you see that those are significantly bigger than, for example, going to Asia, going to Central America, going to South America, or even going to Europe in some cases. So, just to leave that hanging there. Now, what can we do to unleash growth in the Caribbean? In the little time I have left, let me propose you some ideas, and during the Q&A, you tell us how wrong we have hit it. Going back to the energy costs, the energy matrix in the Caribbean is very, very focused on oil. That first chart, you see that the bar on the left has many different colors. That's the world. It has a mix of renewables, it has a mix of oil, has a mix of LNG. You look at the Caribbean, it's all blue. It's mostly oil. The matrix is very dependent on oil. So when oil prices move in the world market, which nobody has a clue on how they move or when they move, really, no matter what economists tell you, the Caribbean suffers those fluctuations. So it becomes very vulnerable to movements. The Jamaica experience is an interesting one to highlight. Jamaica has gone from just about a full reliance on oil to a much more balanced mix between oil and LNG. The Bogue plant, the conversion of the Bogue plant, to those of you following really nerdy news, to LNG, that's been a big step. And now we're going to have another 190 megawatt plant coming in the next 2 years. So that's going to generate that third column that you're going to see, that you see over there. That takes us to a much smaller dependence on oil. Something else that can be done is the financial inclusion. Those of you who are interested in the nitty-gritty details of this, please look it up in the book. What is here saying is that things like participation costs, which is how much does it cost to open a bank account, to be part of the financial system. Things like spreads that I mentioned, how much do banks charge to take your deposit versus give a loan. How much collateral you have to put up. All of these things, if you loosen them, countries can gain in growth. So if you loosen all of these things together, the kicker of this is that if you do it all together, you actually get what we economists call non-linear gains. So they compound upon each other, and it actually creates a positive cycle where growth grows on growth. And this financial inclusion is an interesting thing because it's one of the few things you actually get growth and you get less inequality. So you get what we call inclusive growth. So the chart on the right shows how much your Gini in each one of these countries could improve if financial inclusion was improved. So you get gains that are very well distributed amongst the population. On crime, this is, as you may know, this is not really the IMF's expertise area. But there are economic ways to think about crime. Crime, one side is what are the gains of becoming a criminal and what are the costs of being a criminal. Gains of being a criminal is whatever loot I can get. And the cost of being criminal is the prison sentence, potentially death, and issues like your own emotional baggage and your family's cost. If you put it in an economic framework, you understand that it's not a problem you can solve just with one way through. You have to take care of multidimensional issues. You have to look at prevention. You have to look at, from youth, what is causing the lack of opportunities that is driving people into crime. Deterrence. How do I really stop you? If I have a very strong police, if I know the moment I commit a crime, I will go into prison with very severe sentences, that might stop me. And then at the same time, for criminals, how do we rehabilitate and bring these people to become productive citizens in society? So it needs a multidimensional approach. And then last but not least, resilience. Going back to the natural disasters. And the first chart basically shows the story that I told before. Disasters come often. Disasters hit with very significant intensity. The second one, it's a favorite of mine, which asks, is it worth to prevent? Is it worth to work towards prevention before the disaster hits? How do we prevent disasters? No, you can't change the weather. You put in strong infrastructure. You buy financial instruments like insurance to make sure that when disaster hits, you will have the money, the immediate disbursement for the relief, and you will have support in order to rebuild and reconstruct the country. So it pays off. Once again, really, really good eyesight. Those of you, I don't know if you can see this. There's a red dotted line in that blue bar chart. The last 3 bars over there basically tell you that there is payoff in preventing against disasters before they happen, rather than just taking them as they come and then going for aid, which is, as the World Bank put it once, it's the begging bowl approach. I've been told my time is up. Let me just put this up for you. It's really the summary of everything I've talked about. Every country has their own constraints. For some of them, it's crime, like Jamaica, and debt, like Jamaica. For others, it's doing business, how to improve structural factors, how to improve the banking system so that it can give better loans. So this is, I believe the university will make these slides available to everybody. Take a look at it, pick out your own countries, see if it makes sense to each one of you. And I have another boring concluding slide, but I'm going to bid, and this just goes over what I've talked about all through. Thank you very much for your attention.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Joyce, for the overview of the book. I have about 10 minutes to respond. This is really very difficult, but I'll try. Now, the central theme of the book is that the Caribbean's slow growth is due to adverse external shocks, persistent domestic macroeconomic imbalances, and structural problems. Large macroeconomic imbalances retard growth and reduce the capacity to deal with shocks. Structural factors include high energy costs, constrained access to capital, high crime, and emigration of skilled workers. Violent crime in the Caribbean is 3 times as large as in non-Caribbean small states and costs approximately 4% of GDP per year. The analysis places countries into 2 groups: commodity exporting and tourism-intensive countries. The former were largely insulated by the high international commodity prices from the financial crisis, and their government debt actually fell by 11% of GDP between 2006 and 2011, while the tourism-intensive countries experienced a 9.3% rise in government debt. Since 2011, however, the commodity boom has turned to bust, so the commodity intensive countries have taken a downturn. Now, the study cites weak total factor productivity between 2000 and 2015, with total factor productivity contributing 0.6 percentage points to growth in commodity exporting countries and minus 1.4 percentage points in tourism-intensive countries. Hossman and Klinger, 2009, is quoted in the text. And here I quote, For Caribbean economies, is small market sizes preventing firms from moving to new and more productive activities? Proactive government intervention in the form of strategic bets may be appropriate. End quote. Now, I'm not sure if the IMF is in support of this sentiment or not. Even though the book warns against picking winners, because unlike larger economies, small states cannot place several bets in the hope that some will pay off. So I'd really like some clarity from the IMF if there's a fundamental shift in their thinking. Tourism is important, accounting for between 7% and 90% of GDP in different countries, as well as 12% of direct employment and a further 20% of indirect employment. The Caribbean share of global tourism market has been falling since 1990. This is due to a lack of diversification, we are told, and the region's vulnerability to natural disasters, inadequate infrastructure, and high prices emanating from electricity and labor costs. Now, it is really difficult to imagine that labor in the tourist sector in Jamaica is overpriced, when many of the tourism workers are barely able to eke out a living. While diversification would reduce vulnerability, it would also reduce the effectiveness of sales effort for a given budget. This study found that the number of airlines had a positive and statistically significant impact on arrivals and expenditure, but the number of hotel rooms did not. Interestingly, crime was found to have no significant impact. Since 1950, the Caribbean has been hit by 324 natural disasters, killing 250,000 persons and affecting more than 24 million persons, with an economic impact exceeding $22 billion measured in constant 2009 prices, compared with $58 billion globally, which includes the Caribbean. Nearly 10% of the disasters caused damage of more than 30% of GDP in small states. Grenada's damage from the 2004 hurricane was 200% of GDP. Climate change is expected to exacerbate the impact of natural disasters. Public policy can incorporate preparation and mitigation efforts. However, political economy factors may intervene. Governments reap more political points from responding to disasters than from preventative work. There is some evidence, though weak, that tax incentives have supported foreign direct investment in the Caribbean, particularly in tourism. Countries think these are vital for attracting and retaining FDIs and for compensating for inefficiencies in the economy. However, on a 2013 survey, investors indicated that tax incentives were not very important and were not decisive in their investment decisions. They were far less significant than the impact from economic and institutional environment. Tax incentives are very costly, ranging from 4.4 to 7% of GDP during 2010-13. Now, sound economic principle advocates a broadening of the tax base and reducing the tax rates and elimination of tax discretions. Political economy issues seem to have forced the IMF to a position of, well, if we can't eliminate these, let's streamline incentive schemes to minimize the cost and reduce distortions by not favoring specific activities. In Jamaica, tax expenditure, that is the amount of money which the government gives up for tax incentives, have decreased from more than 8% of GDP in 2008 to 4% of GDP in 2015. Many advanced countries have economic citizenship programs. These programs have helped to improve fiscal positions in some Caribbean countries. Flows from from this program into St. Kitts and Nevis in 2014 accounted for 14% of GDP, and for the region as a whole, 4.1% of GDP in 2015. These flows are, however, volatile and vulnerable to conditions elsewhere in the world. Only 48% of Caribbean firms have access to credit versus 95% in advanced countries. Lowering collateral requirements and participation costs could boost economic activity, but could also expose the economy to instability. The book indicates that half of the Caribbean countries are, quote, underserved by banks, and that the strong performance of Jamaica and the Bahamas are linked to the proliferation of banking access points in tourism areas. I suspect that Jamaica's banking access has little to do with tourism. Most branches and ATMs are not concentrated in tourism areas. Caribbean financial sectors are large relative to the size of their economies, and they are dominated by banks. 60% of the assets are held by foreign banks. Emergency liquidity assistance facilities, the primary response tool for dealing with systemic shocks to financial stability, are underdeveloped in the Caribbean, thus increasing the likelihood of regional spillovers. Non-performing loans in the region is high compared with most other regions, averaging 12% and 9% of the value of loans in tourism intensive and commodity exporting economies, respectively. Worsening asset quality can be attributed to both macroeconomic and bank-specific factors. The book suggests that resolution of non-performing loans is hampered by a lack of markets for distressed assets, gaps in information, and the legal framework. Loss of corresponding banking is potentially a huge problem, even in cases in which the respondent banks have maintained corresponding banking relationships. Certain types of services have been adversely affected. Those include operations that are cash intensive or that involve large numbers of relatively small transactions. The cost of maintaining corresponding banking services has risen substantially, doubling or even tripling in some cases. 40% of the Caribbean firms identify electricity costs as a constraint to doing business. The average value of oil imports doubled between 2005 and 2014. The policy response the book suggests is increased consumption efficiency and diversification where technically feasible. The book tackles the subject of the net effect of emigration, the brain drain versus remittance flows. Immigrants account for more than 20% of the region's population and 76% of those with tertiary education. Remittances average 7% of GDP and are now the most important external flows for the region. They are an important macroeconomic stabilizer in the Caribbean, facilitating private consumption smoothing and boosting financial sector soundness and fiscal space. The net effect, however, is that the Caribbean could have lost as much as 10% of GDP in cumulative growth. Retaining educated persons in the Caribbean is a challenge. The book suggests exploring avenues such as medical tourism. It also raises the efficacy of a policy which subsidizes brain drain using public funds. Thank you very much.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, as I invite the panelists to join me on the podium, I'm going to ask that the persons with questions just indicate with a raise of hands. There are 4 ushers around with mics who will pass the mics to you, so just get your questions ready. Panelists, please join me. Okay, I see a hand there. Can you?
Good morning. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. My name is Helen Ann Wilkinson. I'd like to ask Professor Wong. I was interested in the story you had about your mother, and I wonder about the women in Jamaica. Many of them downtown now, really busy, and what connection could be made. They're sacrificing their lives in sun and rain. There are no bus sheds in downtown Kingston, nothing. Yet people commit themselves to working for Jamaica and providing. So if I go downtown with $100 Jamaican dollars, I can guarantee you of being fed, watered, and clothed, and shoes on my feet, because people downtown care. Is there any way we can make connection that the IMF can go down there and make connection with those economists to help to see what can be done and listen to their solutions? Thank you.
Are you taking?
Yes, I'm going to take a round. With the next hand, Reno, go ahead.
Sorry, Edwin Tollery, actually. Well, not an economist, but nobody's mentioned the aspect of pensions and retirement planning, and I think that's something that seriously threatens to undermine economic growth and any attempts at social protection. And we're losing a lot of generational wealth. Money is just disappearing, and we believe maybe at most 40% of Jamaica's population has made adequate provisions for retirement. Dr. Wong, I don't know if you'd like to speak to this. What the IMF consensus is on this, and whether they'd assist in this area in terms of institutional strengthening and capacity building, as the former speaker said. Thanks.
Okay.
Stephen Williams, even though the socio-political structures in the Caribbean have changed, I noticed that there is no mention of the neo-colonial ties that Caribbean countries have with metropolitan countries, and how does that actually affect our economy? If there is any research showing where are we on the path to development as it relates to the path that they have set for us. Yes, I think that's it.
Okay, I'll take one more. Go ahead. Oh, sorry.
That's Brown. In terms of economic efficacy, isn't it a far better outcome to use tax revenues, for example, to look at the inhibitors to growth rather than to increase income disparity, for example, by giving tax break to those people who are already well off?
Okay, I'll give you guys an opportunity to respond. I think there are a few questions for you, Joyce. I'm not sure about the rest of the panelists.
Okay, let me go in order. On the women's issue, that's a topic close to heart. The Caribbean is very different for women. In most of the world, we talk about increasing female labor force participation. We don't talk about that for the Caribbean. The Caribbean, the women work, and as you say, they work hard. And the question, what is lacking in the Caribbean a lot, is a support system for the women. There's a lot of prevalence of single-parent households in the Caribbean. There's a lot of women who are supporting their children, supporting their parents, and working, not just in downtown, as you mentioned, but also in rural areas. And we are examining this. From our part, we can suggest policies, but a lot of these policies, what they have to do is also to change the culture and the mentality on how to support women in their economic endeavors. A lot of studies have been done, for example, in Africa, that when loans are made to entrepreneurial women, they tend to fare better, they tend to pay back the loans, they tend to do extremely well. And this is where we also talk about the access to finance part. So yes, a lot of the policies we talk about affect women indirectly, but yes, more needs to be done to also directly support the women. But a lot of these things, just from my experience, seeing, for example, in Nordic countries, where the introduction of paternity leave, which forces fathers to take leave to be with their newborn children, that has generated a lot of cultural change. That is not just that the mommy, I hear clapping here, and we should clap, because it's not just that the mother should be the main caretaker, that this should be a familial duty. On the issue of pensions and the social safety net in Jamaica, the NIS needs a significant reform. And I understand that the government has been working both with the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank on that issue. Because it's not just, we can't do patchwork fixing. This is, as you say, these are the real savings of the Jamaicans. We need a large holistic reform to examine things like the national insurance system, examine other parts of the social safety net, like the PATH program, like the school feeding program, like transportation. All of Jamaica's social safety net needs to be looked at in a holistic way. And this is a long endeavor. It's been ongoing, and we hope that it'll be concluded soon. But before that, I'm sure a lot of consultations will have to take place with the Jamaican people on what they envisage as reforms. There was a question here on the development. One of the topics that I mentioned was the issue of the loss of the preferential trade agreements. In many ways, this is a big structural break that, in a sense, is setting these countries onto a new path, a path that is different from what these countries have been engaged in since independence. So that alone will have to engage into a diversification, into moving the economy in a different way than, for example, exporting commodities, which were coming in at very good prices from the European Union. I'll let my colleagues here who might know more of the region to address also that question.
I think I'll answer the question on tax which you raised. I think the point Joyce was making in the presentation is in the Caribbean, what we see is a competition for investment. And so a lot of countries give tax incentives, tax breaks to investors, many of them who do very well. And there's a risk of race to the bottom, where everybody starts competing with other countries. And so the point we're trying to make is to reduce these incentives, streamline them, so that you could use these tax incentives, or you could use the tax revenue for more productive investment, like infrastructure and so on. So that's a more broad point we make about where to allocate your resources. And that's the point we're making here, that these tax incentives have been good, they've gotten some investment, but they come at a huge cost. And that's the point we want to redirect the tax revenues to more productive investment, infrastructure, social safety nets, and so on.
I would add that starting off with tax incentives, although we don't talk about it in detail in the book, the whole issue of regional collaboration is also very important. So whereas tax incentives actually probably do make a difference to individual countries in the Caribbean, they don't actually generate, from a Caribbean-wide perspective, any additional investment. It just determines whether a certain hotel will invest in Grenada as opposed to invest in Jamaica. It doesn't actually increase the overall pool of investment in the region. So again, although we haven't touched it in this book, and it's something for our future research, again, it's a tired subject, but we are going to revisit the whole history or issue of regional collaboration and cooperation, because as in the case of tax incentives, as in the case of citizenship by investment programs, which we're seeing play out right now in the Eastern Caribbean, there's this race to the bottom, which from a Caribbean-wide perspective may help one, but it pits that one against the other, and from a Caribbean perspective, there's no improvement. I want to also add to the discussion on the social safety nets, on the social insurance and retirement schemes. I agree with everything that my colleague said. Another thing which we have to also consider, and that's why we talk about unleashing growth, is that in a sense, the social safety net that we provide and the retirement benefits that we provide are going to be dependent on how much growth the economy can generate, and therefore, put aside to its aged and its infirm. So the issue of growth and generating growth, although there's an endogeneity there, growth is going to determine as well how well we can support a type of retirement system, a pension system that will raise the standards of living of those persons.
Too much to add to what my colleagues already said, but on the issue of tax incentives, I also wanted to say that in addition to regional integration to prevent race to the bottom, it would also be very good for individual country authorities to look more carefully and critically into the effectiveness of these tax incentives. And in a number of countries, we are already seeing this move to see we are providing all these incentives, but is it really creating employment, job opportunities, and the investment that we are really trying to attract? So if more and more countries are doing this kind of analysis, it could probably be very helpful in streamlining the tax incentives that are not going to be contributing to the real economy as much as it is hoped.
Okay, I'll take another round. There are two here, and we'll go back up.
Good morning. My name is Leslie Seymour. You mentioned the functions of the IMF, and the one that caught me most is providing financing for countries with issues of balance of payments and capacity building. Now, in the book, you outlined a lot of factors that affect a country's economic growth and their potential to grow. So my question is, when the IMF structures programs for Caribbean countries, because you hear a lot of it in the news, are these factors considered in this? Okay, so because I know for some Caribbean countries, let's just take one factor, brain drain. In Jamaica, brain drain might be more of a social issue where Jamaicans see a lot of more developed countries as a utopian dream, so they'd want to go there because of that. Whereas for other Caribbean countries, it might be a serious economic issue that drives people away from their domestic country. So I want to know if the IMF considers all of these factors when they're creating programs for countries. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Cord Campbell. Having seen some of the work that you have done, and I'm sure the governments that you work with have seen it as well, what is in place to effect these changes? For example, the IMF says, I would like this aspect of your public sector to change. What is in place to ensure that something is done, something is actually done, instead of waiting on the government's own personal motivations, which, as you said, are not as reliable?
Hello everyone, my name is Alex Foot, and I would like to know, in light of the structural issues that Jamaica has, right, I don't see our economy reaching a level where we can pay back our debt within the next 20 years. What can be done to stimulate a discussion for some sort of debt forgiveness or a level of decreasing the rate at which our debt is climbing as it relates to our country, to the IMF? And this is a question for anyone on the panel, not just Dr. Wong. But how can we, moving further, decrease at least the rate at which our debt is rising? Yeah.
Quickly, because there have been people waiting behind you.
Okay, the next question, the geopolitical issues that we have, the Asian tigers have been allowed to develop. What are some of the geopolitical issues that the Caribbean face that is mitigating our economies?
Good morning. My name is Darren Acosta. I have a question for Dr. Wong. What are the strategies the IMF recommends to reduce corruption in Jamaica? Because it's a very big issue.
Could you please go to corruption? Okay.
Corruption in Jamaica, yeah.
Okay, the question, I'll come back down at the top.
Okay, thank you. I'm Carmen Rivas from the Embassy of Spain. I have an obsession lately. What about the lack of integration with the Latin-speaking Caribbean? Because I don't even think you think of the Spanish-speaking Caribbean countries as part of the Caribbean. And I wonder whether crime issues, violence, and which are hindering also Central American countries, which is also part of the Caribbean, I don't see that conversation happening at the political level or at the economic level. Having said, though, that the private sector, it is communicating between Spanish-speaking countries. The hotels here in Jamaica were from Spanish investors were first in Domrep. But the Prime Minister, for the first time in 25 years, went to Domrep recently. So what do you think about that? Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, morning everyone. Morning to the panelists and everyone here. My name is Demari. My question is away from home. It is more towards Venezuela. The problem that they're currently having right now, right? My question is really about how can Venezuela meet its obligations for next year, which I know is 8 billion, or I think so, and this year, which is 1 point, a number, I don't remember. But for the panelists, seeing that Venezuela is so sanctioned heavily, how can they meet that obligation for this year and next year? Just a suggestion, really. So for me, I can understand how.
Thank you.
There's one up here. 2.
Yes, I'm Mark Shane Scale, graduate student. My question is, I've been looking at tourism. There's kind of a bias towards foreign direct investment in the hotels. So I wanted to know if in your book you looked at Airbnbs as well, and the new community-based approaches to tourism.
Okay, one last one. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Mark Goodman. I was wondering if the IMF ever gets involved in education policy and setting out suggestions as to that. You know, Jamaicans today in high school learn Julius Caesar and all this other stuff. Is that really what we should be learning? Seems like we should be kind of in a more vocational direction. No?
So I turn back to the panel for responses.
Let me answer the general questions here. There was one question.
Quiet, please.
There was one question on how does the fund help in terms of getting the programs done. To be very honest, when we do our surveillance of countries, so if a country does not borrow from the IMF, we do what we call as regular surveillance, bilateral surveillance, Article 4 consultations. There we provide advice to countries on what could be done, right? At the end of the day, it's up to the country to decide whether to take on or not, right? No, that's in the context of plain vanilla surveillance. We provide advice, we're like any other consultants, we provide advice, it's up to the countries to take it or not. When you provide financing to the countries, the assumption there is we don't take collateral from countries when you lend to them. For us, the collateral are the policies. So we advocate policies which are part of the program, right? And so the hope is that once a country adopts these policies, you get back to good growth with stability and can pay back the fund. So the policies there are part of what we call as conditionality. So there we have more leverage compared to a pure surveillance case. So that's the point. There was a point about, what's the other point? On social, was it? Yeah. On social policy. So on education. Again, there we talk about the focus of fiscal spending in terms of what would be good in terms of increasing productivity in the economy, what's good in terms of productive investment and so on. But we don't get into specific aspects of education policy. That's something which is done better by institutions like the World Bank and the IDB. So that's, I would say that. On Venezuela, again, just to add, you can add on to what I said. On Venezuela, the question there is a crisis going on there. It's the humanitarian crisis is pretty significant. We project the economy to contract quite significantly. So there is a need for significant adjustment starting from the fiscal and so on. And that we, at this point in time, we don't have much of an engagement with Venezuela. So when things change, we could get more involved in terms of providing advice and so on to the country.
So,
Okay, I don't know if I'm going to get all the questions. There was a question about debt and how we can at least help to address the increase in debt. In fact, that's being done now. If you look at the Jamaica program in particular, and we went through this debt, a number of debt exchanges. Joyce can correct me, but part of the fiscal adjustment that was required in that program was to bring down the debt as a % of GDP over time. So we're not advocating that debt be wiped out completely, but rather debt be manageable and not impinge on the ability of a country to carry out the other growth enhancing types of activities and social types of activities that are very important. So fiscal adjustment is one aspect of that, which is part of our programs. The whole issue of debt restructuring is another aspect of it. And as I said before, Jamaica went through its own series of debt restructuring. Now, in the case of Jamaica, this idea that debt relief is going to be the answer, I want to be cautious here. There are two things that for Jamaica are very, very important. One is that the majority of debt in Jamaica, or the majority of government debt in Jamaica is not owed to foreigners. It's owed to other Jamaicans. It's owed to those who invest. It's part of the pool of investment that Jamaicans themselves make. So when you talk about how can we do it, ideally, you could have a social partnership or a social contract where those who are willing, those who hold these government of Jamaican assets would agree to reduce that. There's a limit to where that will go, and so that has made the problem more intractable. When we tried to do it a couple times, the issue was you have to be aware that in reducing or trying to reduce the value of the assets or reprice the assets that compose these domestic debt instruments, then the banking system and the financial system that holds a lot of these assets might themselves be impaired, and therefore you're just moving the problem from one part of the economy to another part of the economy, and you don't really resolve it. Okay. I think we have to cut.
Yes.
The managing director is here, so happy to continue this in private at some other time, but I think we have to break.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you to thank the panelists for us. Thank you very much. Just a reminder, you can go. The questions for the Q&A with the MD, right? You see in the back of your programs. You need to log on to Slido if you have questions that you want to ask to the MD when she comes in for that section. The event code that you're going to go into to enter your questions is IMF. Please note that if you do not identify yourself, the questions will not be fed through to the MD. We're going to be showing a video while the stage is going to be reconfigured, so we ask that you remain in your seats until the next session begins. Thank you very much. There's one more. A public service announcement. Can Gabriella Howell identify herself if she's in the room?
Gabriella Howell, okay. Abigail Letman.
Abigail Letman. Are you here? Still here? She saw her hand? I didn't see her hand. Christoph Simpson. Are you still here?
We, the world, must stand together. We can achieve that greater prosperity that will benefit all, not just a fortunate few. Winning the championship of growth and inclusive globalization requires teamwork and collaboration around the world.
Can I get everybody's attention, please? I'm going to ask everybody to please, once Mr. Lagarde arrives, I'm going to ask everybody to please remain seated. Unfortunately, you're not going to be able to, we're going to ask everybody to stay put and not leave throughout the next section of the event. Is that clear? Everybody hearing me? Thanks.
My body massively. Oh, me love the way you keep me all night. I can't imagine without you out of sight. I know mama say that it's not.
Good morning and welcome. This is a critical time in the Caribbean, what with increasingly intense hurricanes, what with the Caribbean being amongst the most indebted regions in the world, and with what it seems as well, many of the developing countries are retreating into protectionism away from the move to globalization. It is particularly interesting, I think, for Jamaica, because Jamaica has just completed one successful IMF program and is in the midst of another. It has now engaged 5 years of economic reform. So notwithstanding the hostility of the global environment, Jamaica is making every effort that it can to position itself to take as best advantage of the situation as it is. So it is even more critical to Jamaica. Jamaica has positioned itself, and we are really excited that you chose this moment to come and engage Jamaicans and the students to see if you can help us to understand what are the prospects at this stage and how international organizations like the fund can help, or in the opinions of some, hinder. In that context, it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome you to the University of the West Indies. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Professor, for having me, and thank you to all of you who've decided to take a little bit of time to just be together. To do two things, if I may offer. I would like to first of all acknowledge your talents and your willingness for many of you to have participated in the essay contest that we have launched. There are quite a few students from your good university who have entered the race, and many of them have demonstrated immense economic understanding coupled with a deeply rooted understanding of the Caribbean society and of the respective countries in the Caribbean. So, if I may, Professor, I would like to first of all give the award publicly and officially in front of everyone here. And I have to tell you that, first of all, the topic that they worked on was how to achieve inclusive and resilient growth in the Caribbean. So that is exactly spot on the question that you just raised. And, in doing that, they, of course, took into account the external situation, the shocks of all sorts. But they also looked at the entrenched factors that are specific to the Caribbean and that eventually prevent growth from really flourishing and being of sustainable high quality. And it was difficult to choose the top three. We had endeavored that they would be the top three. And because it was so difficult, we decided to also recognize the fourth and the fifth best essays that were submitted. And the members of the jury had a challenge actually choosing those. But what I would like to do is announce the winners of the Caribbean Essay Contest. They might not all be in the room today, but I know some of them are, and I will ask them to come down as I mentioned their names. So let me start with the ones that we ranked 5th and 4th, and those are, and they start with the honorable mentions. So it's Mrs. Tadja Wunkel and Mrs. Shanike Rodden. If you're here, please come down. In the third place was the essay submitted by Mr. Wendell E. Ivy. And he's a student at University of West Indies, Mona. In second place was the essay submitted by Mr. Keenan Falconer, who is also a student at University of West Indies, Mona. Please join us, yes. And the winner, who is getting the first prize, who will receive an internship at the Jamaica IMF offices. I would like to invite Miss Cara Joan, who's a student at University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, Barbados. So, Cara submitted a top-notch essay citing lack of social justice, lack of political unity in the region, and a linear approach to development as the critical bottlenecks to growth. And the judges were most impressed with the quality of her essays. Where are you? Oh, you're hiding over there. Come on. And you know what I would like to say is that the 4 jury members, independently, because they did not consult with each other, actually ranked your essay as first in that hugely talented group. So it was a very independent decision that they reached. And you know, clearly, it's remarkable that you all came up with this work, and we would like to congratulate you. Each of you are getting a prize. You don't all get the top-notch prize of having the internship at the IMF office, but we all look forward to following your career and the development of your talent as you go forward. So with that, I think we are entitled to a little photo all together. Well done to all of you, really. So a big round of applause to the 5 of them. Bravo!
Madam, can I get one with just you and the winner? Get one with just yourself and the winner.
Of course, yeah. Where is your photo? Your photo man. Thank you. Really great job.
Congratulations. Well done.
So, that having been done, and with great joy on our part, and I hope with you too, I don't have a structured set of notes that I want to go through with you. And I have no idea exactly what you are most interested in. So that gives us a completely white page to start the conversation. And I would much prefer to actually have a conversation than give you a lecture, because I don't think that it is really the most appropriate way to better understand each other if I start lecturing. So, I turn the floor over back to you. Who has a question, and how shall we get that conversation going?
Is Gabriela Howell in the room? Yes, Gabriela has a question.
Oh, I see. You've all prepared your questions, so you're all reading from your... Please go ahead.
Actually, my first question. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, how will the public sector...
They can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Okay,
yes.
Good. I'm sorry. How will the public sector reform initiative help economic growth if so many persons in the public sector will lose their jobs? And a follow-up question to that is, do you believe that the private sector is capable of helping to get those persons employed?
Okay. You know, I will answer your question drawing on the experience that I have had myself as former finance minister for France between 2007 and 2011, which was just the year when the crisis hit and when we had endeavored to conduct some big reforms. We had to look at the public sector, and we had to look at the cost of it and the benefits that it gave to the people. Because the public sector is not there to just hold jobs. It is there to serve the people, provide a service to the people. So when you conduct that exercise and when you want to have a good set of benefits against the cost that the public is putting into public service, inevitably you are bound to find pockets of inefficiencies, agencies that have served a purpose 20 years ago, but that have survived because nobody has determined that it was no longer serving a purpose. You will find divisions that could easily be merged with other to better consolidated provide the service that is needed. So it's not an issue of cutting for the sake of cutting, but re-examining the purpose for which certain agencies, certain services were developed over the course of time and determine whether or not that is useful. I'll give you an example that I draw from my own experience. When we did that, we found out that there were, from many years before, a large group of computer programmers who were qualified in Fortran language. And Fortran is a really, for those of you who know about computer coding, it goes way back. But they were there because of the anticipation of the 2000 bug, which everybody feared at the time, and which we thought would need the people who knew how to code from those days in order to adjust the system. Well, the 2000 bug eventually, didn't turn out to be the bad bug that we all thought it would be. But that group of computer programmers just stayed there. And they stayed there with no job, with having nothing to do, but they had been hired. They were part of the public service, so they stayed. And as we were re-examining each and every agency, we found out that maybe that was not the best use of public finance, and that their talent could be repurposed to things that would be far more useful, or some of them who were getting very close to retirement could be early retired so that the savings that were generated as a result could be refocused onto something that was more useful. So I think that that particular exercise is actually healthy. It's healthy provided that, of course, there is enough trade-off so that you do not create additional unemployment that accumulates. And so that it is conducted in that fashion, you need to either repurpose and retrain for those who are willing to do it, for those who are capable of doing it, for those who are not that close to retirement that they have already retired in the head. In that case, you need to help them along. And provided that everybody understands what will happen with the savings. Will it be affected to better designed salary schemes with incentives to produce value for the people? Will it be allocated to growth enhancing investments? Will it be creating more security for the people? That's what needs to happen. And it's by having the two, in other words, the necessary exercise of readjusting a system on the one hand and allocating the savings to either training, replacing, refocused public services or investment that needs to happen. Now, separately from that, I think that the private sector needs to be encouraged to develop activity in Jamaica, in the Caribbean at large. And, to do so, they need to understand that there are talents, incredible talents, that there is productivity and productivity potential, that there is a business-friendly environment, and that it is profitable for them to look at those opportunities and to further invest and develop activities and create jobs. But I think the two don't necessarily go together. Providing a business-friendly and efficient environment is a necessity, comes what may, in terms of public service.
Thank you. Ryan Cameron has a skeptical view of all of this.
Where are you? Why are you so far away? I can't see you. I'm an old lady. Come. It's a lot better, and you must be an athlete. I can see that.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, everybody can hear you.
So, has the IMF involvement in any country resulted in a stable economy?
Slow down. Slow down. You're moving too fast.
So, has the IMF involvement in any country resulted in a stable economy and higher standards of living?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. You know, if I look at the region that I come from, and the work that we've done in countries like Ireland, like Portugal, like Iceland, like Hungary, like Spain, where we have helped with the reorganization of the financial system, I think that there has been significant improvement, including for the standard of living of people. There's no question in my mind. If I look at countries in Asia, where 20 years ago our involvement was difficult, was laborious, and was hard on people, let's face it. At the time, the programs were very heavily front-loaded and resulted in massive inflation, exchange rate fluctuations that were causing harm for a short period of time. If I look at it, a few years later, there has been significant improvement in the standard of living, in the structure of society, in the strength of the economy, and in the independence of those economies vis-à-vis the rest of the world and vis-à-vis the financial markets. So I think that, we are heavily criticized very often, because essentially when we are called upon helping, we provide international community financing, but at the same time, we have to discuss with the country that is receiving that assistance. We have to discuss how it will restore its financial stability, how it will restore its public finance, how it will be able to gain access to financing in order to finance its growth going forward. So it's inevitably hard, because if the countries were not in a tough situation, they could do it by themselves. They could just carry on. And if they call upon us, is that they came to a point where they couldn't do the reforms, they couldn't do the restructuring, they couldn't do the fiscal consolidation that was needed because of, too loose a set of policies for too many years, or without recognition that discipline is in order, because you just can't spend for a long period of time more than you actually earn. That's a pretty basic principle. But I think, honestly, that once that hard moment is past, then the situation improves. And honestly, I think this is happening and will happen. When I look at, the number of new jobs, when I look at unemployment, when I look at the determination to build and consolidate the social safety net to make sure that the issue of poverty and creation of jobs are really addressed and improved, I think this is you're going to see some really impressive results.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you to go on to put that in the context of Jamaica.
Yeah.
I mean, Jamaica's situation 6 years ago was dire. One of the most indebted countries in the world, having the highest debt service burden.
I think you're right, apart from Japan, which is a very special case, but I think it was the second largest indebted country in the world.
Right, and the highest debt service burden, because the interest rates were higher.
Yeah.
And at the same time running large fiscal deficits. Jamaica has implemented to the letter one of the most challenging IMF programs, maintaining levels of primary surplus faithfully that the Greeks, which needed it more, couldn't maintain. At this point, you're optimistic about Jamaica?
Yes, without reservation. Because I see, what has been achieved over the last 5 years is, as I said in the press conference earlier today, is no less than remarkable. And you look at the numbers. Employment is up. Unemployment is down. Inflation is under control. There is much more price stability now. you have a debt that is, I know it doesn't mean much of anything, but look at the debt for what it is. It's a liability that you pass on to your generation, followed by the next generation. That's what it is. And to go from 140% of GDP back 5 years ago to where it is now, and further continuing to go down. We are at what, 110? Where are you? Roughly 110, and trending down, with the objective of being at 60% in 2025. So that's a huge achievement, which in and of itself, satisfying for the economists, but it's satisfying in terms of what baggage you run with. When you are looking at the future, when you're looking at, setting up a business, being an entrepreneur, developing your skills, you just don't want to have to run with a bag of stone on your back. You want that debt to have been paid off, to be behind you, so that you can develop, and I think that is really what is going to happen. Now, clearly, everybody has to continue to be steady and to really reinforce the credibility that has been earned already in the last 5 years, so that people look at Jamaica and they don't think to themselves, huge talent, fantastic culture, great music, athletes that amaze the world, good economists, but are they really going to stay the course? Are they going to be off track as has happened in the past? No. You need to continue this what I hope will be a virtuous cycle where you have more activity, more jobs, people see a future which is not about gangs and being on the streets and setting record for crimes. That's not the future of Jamaica.
And at least
I hope the economic reforms can contribute to that.
And at least we have had policy continuity across two administrations, so reason to be hopeful.
Which doesn't happen very often. The only circumstance recently where I've seen it is in the case of Portugal, where the opposition at the time had consented to the program, a bit in the way as Jamaica, then opposition, had said, okay, we support, we're not completely happy with everything, but we support in the interest of the country. Portugal had done the same thing, and it had been really successful.
Antonique Taffy has a question. Is she here?
Yes, she's right here. Tap, tap, tap.
Yes.
Yes,
hello,
we can hear you.
Everyone. Good morning. Well, good afternoon. My question is, can the IMF say with utmost confidence that Jamaica will be able to pay off accumulated debts? If so...
To be what?
Can the IMF say with confidence that we will be able to pay down our debts?
Yeah.
Or accumulated debts, sorry. And if so, how long would it take?
Well, as I said, the objective that has been agreed by the authorities is to arrive at 60% in 2025. Okay? So we are heading into 2018. In the next 8 years, the debt trajectory relative to GDP, and I don't know exactly what hypotheticals we had for GDP, but it must be the potential, which is roughly 2.5-3%. So relative to GDP, it would move from 110 where it is now, from 140 back 4 years ago, down to 60%. And why 60%? 60% is considered for a middle-income country as a debt level where it is completely sustainable and safe going forward. And if it stays at that level, it allows for, investment, financing growth, and all the rest of it. Will it be able to pay its debt? I certainly hope so. Certainly hope so. I would observe that the rate at which Jamaica is financing itself has moved down to the 5-ish%, which is much, much lower than where it was 4 or 5 years ago. And, by various refinancing schemes that are frequent in those situations, when the rate of financing goes down, I certainly hope that the reimbursement will be secured and that, in 2026, think about how old you are then, the debt level of Jamaica will be perfectly consistent with the normal development of a middle-income country.
Thank you. Andre Bogle, are you here? As you mentioned debt. Most of the debt that the Caribbean is carrying actually does not come from fiscal slippage. Most of it comes from liabilities outside of central government that governments end up taking on. A lot of it caused by hurricanes. So while we're busy, fiscally consolidating, how do we protect against these additional debts coming on? As we're bringing one down, more is piling on.
Well, I would say stop the hurricane. And I'm only half joking when I say that, because I think that, the climate change efforts, or the climate change prevention measures that have been negotiated, that have led to the Paris Agreement back 2 years ago, are actually critically important. And to keep the temperature rising more than below 2% would actually be critical for those islands where the sea level rise could be so damaging. So I think that, stop the hurricanes. We will never be able to stop the hurricanes, but reduce the impact of climate change in order to protect those countries that are most vulnerable is number one. Number two, and I believe that this is certainly adopted by the authorities here in Jamaica, include in your budget process, in your policy decisions, the preventive measures that can be adopted by the countries themselves. So anticipate, invest in the infrastructure projects that will be actually helping resist the consequences of hurricanes when they happen. That's another set of measures. Third, I would say that we need to think about the medium term. There will be short-term fix, there will be fundraising, there will be fund pledging, but as you said, they accumulate additional debt. Even if it's concessional and even if some of it is eventually grants and things like that. But in the medium term, what needs to happen is that we have anticipated and taken the mitigating and adaptive measures that will actually protect against the next hurricanes. And we are going to, pull our socks and convene both from the public and the private sector all the stakeholders who can help. And by that I mean insurance companies, reinsurance companies, financial institutions, so that they can all bring their heads together and figure out how and of course all those that are directly impacted, the governments, civil societies, and the public institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and the Inter-American and Development and Caribbean Development banks. So we can all sort of brainstorm and think about those instruments, those pooled instruments as well, that could be put together, could be offered in order to protect against the consequences of the next hurricanes. We haven't yet exactly identified what will be put in place, but I really think that it is worth the effort and the dialogue with all the stakeholders in order to anticipate and prevent.
Very quickly, because our time here is up, but Chavoy Brown wanted to know, what can they do, what can this generation do to support economic development?
Well, I would say that, economic development is going to look probably very different from what we can imagine today. And, looking at you reminds me of my sons, actually. One of them, I hope, is studying at the moment. I would say that the more educated you are, the more open to new technologies, to sciences, and I would say sciences and art, I think the better equipped you will be to deal with the new way of driving economies. There is a huge amount of compounded innovations, whether it's big data, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's quantum computing. that are going to just impact the way in which business is conducted, the way in which the job market is organized. And you have to be completely part of that. And the reason I'm saying sciences and art is that from all accounts and everything that you read about people who are trying to prospect into what this new economy will be like, what these new jobs will be like, many of the things that are done based on our scientific backgrounds, the modelization, the forecasting and all of that, a lot of it is going to be much more heavily supported and maybe driven by a combination of big data, artificial intelligence, data mining, and so on and so forth. So what will be of value is that combination of scientific background and understanding, but also the emotional dimension, the artistic dimension that we human beings are not short of, but needs to be developed and considered as well. So the more you do that, and the more you sort of expand your brain power and your ability to adjust to changes, I think the better equipped you will be to participate in that new economy and turn it for good rather than for dark. I'm particularly concerned about, how some of these technologies can actually be used for good or driven into what is much darker in terms of depth of the internet or darkness of the users made of it. So future is with you, you've heard that many times, but in order to best prepare for it and turn it for the better being of all, you really have to develop your skill set, your brain power, and not only your IQ, but your EQ as well, because I think it's a combination of the two that will work. And speaking of which, the more you can encourage that balance, not only within your brain, but amongst the community, bringing men and women together and making sure that there is no discrimination and that there is equal opportunity to all men and women, I think is going to be critically important.
Thank you very much. It's lovely. Thank you. Well done.
Thank you, and good luck to all of you.